Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
So my paper is called Root and Renewal, Biodynamics as Cultural Legacy. I've shortened it a bit. In 1924, Rudolf Steiner delivered a series of lectures later published as the Spiritual Foundations for the Renewal of Agriculture. I'm just going to read it because I put so much time into writing it nicely, so sorry, everyone. Offered in response to what Steiner perceived as a profound crisis in modern farming, these lectures framed agriculture not merely as a technical or economic activity, but as a curative spiritual practice, one concerned with restoring vitality to soil, food, and the human relationship to the living earth. Steiner identified this crisis as emerging under the pressures of industrialization, mechanization, and chemical warfare following World War I, which had severed ethical, cosmological, and relational dimensions of cultivation. His concern was not the preservation of inherited forms for their own sake, but renewal, the reawakening of living processes within agriculture as a cultural and spiritual task. 100 years later, as biodynamic farmers and anthroposophical communities gather to reflect on Steiner's legacy, the question of renewal remains. Yet the conditions of today seem to differ so markedly from Steiner's time. How do we integrate the contemporary worldview into a biodynamic context and an anthroposophical worldview? This context illustrates that the practice of biodynamics, rooted in the anthroposophical tenets of universal human development and spiritual lawfulness, must confront an essential tension. How can these tenets remain spiritually alive and ethically credible without becoming culturally insular or historically frozen? I argue that biodynamics, as articulated in the Spiritual Foundations for the Renewal of Agriculture, is best understood as a translation of universal principles rooted in a spiritual approach to agriculture, rather than a personal invention of Steiner's. Drawing on historical comparative analysis and my reflection as a first-generation Hungarian-Chinese American woman trained in biodynamic agriculture, I propose that genuine inclusivity is not a moral demand placed on Steiner communities, but an esoteric necessity consistent with Steiner's own impulse toward renewal. By recognizing the resonances between biodynamics and global traditions of spiritual agriculture, particularly in East Asia or Chinese agrarian cosmologies, Korean natural farming, and indigenous land-based systems, biodynamic communities may renew their agricultural and spiritual work in ways that are both faithful to Steiner's intentions and interpretations and responsive to the world as it is now lived. So, Steiner in context, biodynamics as translation or origin. Rudolf Steiner emerged from a complex cultural and intellectual landscape shaped by the Austro-Hungarian borderlands, German idealism, Goethean science, and theosophical currents at the turn of the 20th century. His work consistently sought synthesis between polar opposites, between science and spirit, perception and concept, freedom and responsibility. The agriculture course of 1924 must be understood within this context as a response to widespread concern among European farmers regarding declining soil fertility, reduced nutritional quality of food, and human alienation produced by the mechanized agriculture following World War I. Steiner did not present biodynamics as a closed system or a proprietary doctrine. Rather, he framed it as a way of perceiving the world and working with forces already active in nature, etheric, astral, and cosmic, through conscious ethical participation. Agriculture, in this sense, became a social, spiritual act, capable of healing land and culture. As Ehrenfried Pfeiffer later emphasized in Biodynamic Farming and Gardening, the goal of biodynamics is not dogma, but attentiveness, learning to observe the formative forces at work in soil, plants, animals, and human intention. Seen in this light, Steiner's contribution lies not in inventing spiritual agriculture, but in articulating it within a Western framework of esoteric practice. His genius was in translation. By bringing order to traditional streams of agrarian wisdom through the language of modern spiritual science, Steiner rendered legible, especially to European audiences, the understanding of farming as an imperative moral and cosmological practice. Recognizing this does not diminish Steiner's originality. Rather, it situates it within a broader human inheritance and opens space for comparative dialogue, not attack. So, Before we start, before turning to these comparative traditions, it is useful to briefly name several core principles that characterize biodynamic agriculture as articulated in the spiritual foundations for the renewal of agriculture. These include the understanding of soil as a living organism rather than an inert substrate, the importance of cosmic and seasonal rhythms in shaping plant and animal life, the role of ritualized preparations and intention in mediating between the earthly and cosmic forces, and an ethic of reciprocity between human beings and the land they cultivate. Together, these principles frame agriculture as an activity situated within a living, embodied cosmos rather than a purely extractive system. Long before Rudolf Steiner articulated biodynamics as a form of spiritual science, East Asian agricultural traditions understood farming as a cosmological, ethical, and spiritual practice. In classical Chinese thought, agriculture was inseparable from the moral cultivation and social harmony. Confucian texts, such as the Book of Rites, emphasize the responsibility of rulers and farmers alike to align human activity with the rhythms of heaven and earth, forming a triadic relationship with humanity which sustained cosmic balance. Central to this worldview is the concept of qi, the vital force which animates all living beings and circulates through landscapes, bodies, and seasons. Agricultural practice sought to support the balance and flow of qi through attentiveness and balancing dynamics of the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, which describes the cyclical process of transformation rather than static elements. These concepts function in a manner strikingly similar and parallel to Steiner's descriptions of etheric vitality and formative forces, though they arise from a distinct metaphysical language and lineage. The traditional Chinese agricultural calendar, structured around 24 solar terms, further exemplifies these cosmological attunements. These solar markers, such as the beginning of spring and the autumn equinox, guide planting, harvesting, irrigation, and rest through careful observation of climate, soil moisture, and celestial movement rather than abstract dates. This rhythm-based approach parallels biodynamic attention to lunar and astronomical cycles, revealing a shared emphasis on planetary timing as an ecological practice and ethical consideration. Soil fertility in traditional Chinese farming systems was maintained through highly developed composting and nutrient cycling practices, which emphasize return over depletion. Mark Elvin documents how these systems sustained agricultural productivity for centuries while minimizing erosion and nutrient loss. Ritual offerings to land spirits, particularly to the earth god, were made at field boundaries and village shrines, acknowledging the land as an ensouled presence requiring respect, reciprocity, and restraint. Such offerings reinforce the belief that land responded to human conduct, and that over-extraction or disrespect could lead to imbalance, crop failure, and social disorder. A further point of specificity worth noting is the intimate relationship between agriculture, statecraft, and moral cultivation in Chinese history. Classical texts such as the Guanji and agronomic manuals like Qim and Yao Shu framed successful farming as the foundation of ethical governance. Emperors were ritually obligated to perform symbolic plowing ceremonies to affirm their attunement to heaven's mandate, underscoring the belief that agricultural vitality and moral authority were inseparable. Taoist internal alchemy further reinforced the correspondence between bodily cultivation, landscape vitality, and cosmic order. Closely related to this worldview were longstanding practices of preserving uncultivated margins, groves, boundary spaces as spiritually significant zones rather than wasted land. A striking parallel appears in Steiner's insistence that agricultural landscapes must not be entirely subject to human control. In the agriculture course, Steiner repeatedly emphasized the necessity of leaving such areas uncultivated in order to maintain the presence and activity of elemental beings associated with soil, water, air, and warmth. He warned that overly rationalized farming systems risk driving these beings away, resulting in a loss of vitality and resilience within the farm organism. Read comparatively, Chinese practices of land offerings and preserving wild spaces echo Steiner's guidance on promoting unseen elemental spirits, revealing a shared intuition that fertility arises not through mastery, but through reverence, restraint, and real relationship with unseen forces. How much time do I have left? 10 minutes, okay, thank you. An additional and particularly compelling point of comparison within East Asian agricultural practices is Korean natural farming, developed in the mid-20th century. Korean natural farming emphasizes the intentional cultivation and application of indigenous microorganisms collected from healthy forest soils. These microbial inoculants are propagated through staged fermentations involving leaf litter, grains, sugars, and minerals, and are then reintroduced into agricultural soils to restore vitality, resilience, and balance. Practitioners of KNF have long described these inoculants as carriers of life force or vitality, language that closely parallels biodynamic descriptions of preparations, enlivening etheric processes within compost and soil. However, at the time of their development, such terms were often dismissed as metaphysical and metaphorical. Yet today, soil ecology and microbiology increasingly confirm that diverse microbial communities are essential to nutrient cycling, soil aggregation, plant immunity, and carbon sequestration. The conceptual resonance between biodynamic compost preparations and KNF inoculants is striking. Both rely on cultivating local soil communities, careful timing, the art of fermentation, and nurturing the unseen as central to and sacred to long-term agricultural health. Importantly, KNF emerged independently of Steiner's work, shaped by Korean ecological, cultural, and spiritual contexts rather than Eurocentric esotericism. This independence reinforces a key claim of this paper, that practices aimed at cultivating living soil arise wherever farmers attend carefully to vitality, relationship, and place. Biodynamic preparations and KNF inoculants may thus be understood as complementary expressions of a shared agricultural impulse and intuition rather than competing systems. Comparable principles appear in indigenous agricultural systems across the Americas and beyond, where land is understood as a living being sustained through rhythmic, reciprocal relationships, not as property or inert resource. In contrast to the Baconian concept of a dead earth to be dominated or extracted, indigenous cosmologies understand land as animate, dynamic, relational, and imbued with moral significance. Gregory Cajete describes indigenous science as fundamentally relational, emphasizing responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity rather than control, and situating agricultural practice within a broader cosmological and spiritual framework. Agricultural systems that embody these principles, such as the Three Sisters polyculture planting of corn, beans, and squash, readily demonstrate ecological cooperation, soil regeneration, and seasonal attunement as lived expressions of spiritual lawfulness in agriculture. These practices sustain fertility through interdependence rather than domination, a logic that contemporary ecological movements have only recently begun to recognize and rebrand under terms such as permaculture. Read alongside biodynamic agriculture, such indigenous traditions reveal not an alternative model, but a parallel articulation of the same underlying insight that land thrives when human beings act in participation with living systems rather than attempting frail mastery over them. We're almost done. Okay. Pre-Christian European agrarian traditions organized agricultural life through the cosmological and ritual framework shaped by seasonal cycles, celestial rhythms, and localized spiritual forces. Festivals aligned with solstices and equinox, practices oriented toward land spirits, and ritualized forms of agricultural labor provided the primary spiritual structure for rural communities across Europe, embedding farming within a spiritual and cosmological understanding of the world. Over the course of Europe's Christianization, many of these practices were reinterpreted, displaced, or subordinated as religious authority became increasingly centralized and less directly tied to local land-based forms of spiritual life. Steiner's work may therefore be understood not only as an innovation, but a restoration, a then modern attempt to rearticulate traditional European agrarian spirituality within a contemporary framework. At the same time, Steiner's deep engagement with Christian mysticism allowed him to bridge pre-Christian cosmologies with a future-oriented Christian mysticism, one concerned with moral obligation and renewal rather than return. He was not interested in reviving the past as it had been, but in carrying its wisdom forward in a form capable of speaking to modern human consciousness. This intention is evident in his sustained interest in astrology as a way of understanding cosmic rhythms and formative influences, an approach largely abandoned or dismissed within modern scientific discourse, yet rearticulated by Steiner as a mode of conscious ethical participation, not prediction or superstition. In this sense, Steiner did not treat astrology as a way to cheat fate, but as a means of understanding humanity's ongoing relationship to the wider cosmos, situating the human experience within the universal context of our solar system. As Steiner himself stated in the agriculture course, we must learn to see the earth not as something separated from the cosmos, but as part of it, receiving influences from the whole universe. This sentence captures the heart of his method, to recover past spiritual insight, not by repeating them unchanged, by recontextualizing them and renewing them through conscious ethical participation. Read in this light, Steiner's work models precisely the task now facing biodynamic and Waldorf communities, the responsibility to carry spiritual knowledge forward by allowing it to breathe and evolve rather than fixing it in time, This approach situates Steiner's ideas within a European lineage of spiritual agriculture without positioning Europe as the exclusive source of farming as a spiritual practice. Waldorf education and biodynamic agriculture share a common curative impulse. Both seek to address fragmentation of the human being, of knowledge, of culture through universal rhythms, healing the human spirit, and nurturing holistic engagement. Waldorf pedagogy aims to educate the whole human being by aligning and learning with aligning with developmental stages and cultivating freedom rather than obedience. Yet a structural tension emerges when institutions grounded in universal spirituality remain culturally homogeneous. Resistance to critical reflection can lead to insularity becoming brittle, where preservation of form is mistaken for fidelity. As Dan McCannon observes, applied anthroposophical movements risk losing vitality when they fail to engage effectively with the evolving cultural reality. Just as soil loses life when circulation is blocked, spiritual traditions stagnate when a dialogue is foreclosed or forced or rejected. As a first-generation Hungarian-Chinese American woman, my relationship to Steiner's work is shaped by borderlands, cultural, historical, and spiritual. My training in biodynamic agriculture at the Pfeiffer Center, a site directly connected to Steiner's early students, offered a direct engagement with this lineage, emphasizing practice over ideology. Working across organic, regenerative, and biodynamic farms has reinforced my understanding that the value of tradition lives through active participation, continually renewing and enlivening practices in ways that remain relevant to contemporary experience, while staying reverent to the past. In this way, I understand my role within the world of biodynamics as recognizing the echoes of a shared spiritual and agricultural impulse across cultures, and inviting fellow Steiner practitioners to see these parallels, even when our global histories and ways of being are not the same. The spiritual foundations for the renewal of agriculture were never intended as a final word, but as a prologue, an invitation to consider both ancient and emergent ways of relating to the land and life as a spiritual responsibility. 100 years on, renewal demands more than careful dogmatic preservation of inherited forms. It challenges us to question whether biodynamics truly belongs to a single culture, lineage, or historical moment, or whether it is best understood as an expression of broader human impulses to heal the relationship with the living earth. Seen in this light, biodynamics is not diminished by comparison. It is clarified, revealed as one color within a wider spectrum of a universal spiritual agriculture. If biodynamics is to remain a living spiritual practice rather than a preserved cultural artifact, it must be capable of recognizing itself wherever its principles are present, born or reborn in diverse cultural expressions, ancestral and indigenous agricultural wisdom, and contemporary practices that honor vitality, rhythm, and reciprocity. To recognize biodynamic principles across these varied modalities does not dilute Steiner's work. Rather, it fulfills his deepest intention of renewal, which in Steiner's words was never optional. It was the condition under which spiritual knowledge remained truthful, ethical, and alive. To honor Steiner's work and legacy is not simply to preserve its practices unchanged, but to keep its inner spiritual impulse nourished. Biodynamics was never offered as a finished system, but as a living practice and a spiritual right, one that depends upon continued renewal and conscious participation, ethical responsibility, and responsiveness to life itself. As practitioners of Steiner's work, our task is not to guard his ideas or as fixed inheritances, but to steward them as living legacies, dynamic, permeable to insight, context, and growth. As Steiner writes in The Philosophy of Freedom, truth is not something which can be preserved, but something that must be produced ever anew. Just as soil loses its vitality when the circulation is blocked, spiritual traditions lose life when they are sealed against evolution. To carry biodynamics forward, then, is not merely an act of preservation, but an act of devotion to renewal itself. In this sense, fidelity to Steiner's work is not a blind compliance, but an open and unwavering commitment to the universal principles which comprise the spiritual foundations for the renewal of agriculture. And in my view, these universal principles are truly the root of renewal itself.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.